My son raised his hand against me. And his wife opened the door and said, "Leave." Not in anger. Not in a fit of rage. Calmly. Like she was throwing away something that no longer served a purpose. It was March 17th, 7:42 in the morning. I remember the time because the clock above the stove was ticking too loudly, and the coffee I had poured was still untouched, cooling beside me. I stood there holding a suitcase I hadn't packed. Standing in front of the house I had paid for over 30 years, down to the last property tax receipt, filed neatly in a drawer upstairs. On the kitchen table, one document had been left behind. Not accidentally. Deliberately. Amount, $4,800,000. Signature, my son's. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't even cry. I only thought, very clearly. How could they do this to me? If you want to hear my story to the end, subscribe. Because what happened next didn't just change their lives. It changed mine. My name is Margaret Miller. I am a woman who learned early how to carry weight without letting it show. I was not raised to complain. I was raised to notice what needed doing and to do it quietly. When my husband began forgetting small things, where he set his keys, how long the kettle had been boiling, I was the one who adjusted. I labeled drawers. I paid closer attention. I learned how to repeat myself without sounding tired. By the time the doctor said the word degenerative, I had already been living with it for years. I built my business during that season. Not because I was ambitious, but because bills do not pause for grief. I signed contracts at the kitchen counter while soup simmered on the stove. I learned how to read financial statements late at night, the house humming with the low sound of the refrigerator and my husband's uneven sleep. Some nights I slept in my clothes. Some mornings I forgot what day it was. But the numbers always added up. The checks were always mailed. The employees were always paid. That became my quiet pride, though I never spoke of it aloud. When he could no longer recognize clients, I stepped in. When he could no longer recognize neighbors, I smiled for both of us. I answered questions before they were asked. I learned how to redirect conversations gently, so no one would feel uncomfortable. I did not think of myself as strong. I thought of myself as necessary. There is a difference between being strong and being relied upon. I learned that too late. Ethan grew up watching that. He watched me solve problems without asking for help. Watched me make decisions and live with them. Watched me keep the lights on and the mortgage paid while his friends' families quietly fell apart. He learned that when something went wrong, his mother would handle it. I thought I was teaching him resilience. I did not realize I was also teaching him expectation. Layla noticed too. She came into our lives polished and observant, with a way of listening that felt flattering at first. She asked questions about the house, about the company, about long-term plans. She said things like, "You've built something incredible, and Ethan is so lucky to have you." I mistook her interest for respect. I mistook her attention for affection. She learned my routines quickly. Which drawer held the important papers? Which bank I trusted? Which days I went to the office and which afternoons I stayed home. At the time, it felt harmless. Helpful, even. After my husband passed, the silence in the house grew heavier. It settled into the corners, into the spare bedroom, into the chair he used to sit in every evening. I kept his sweater folded on the back of that chair for longer than I cared to admit. Ethan suggested they move in temporarily. He said it would help everyone. He said it would give me company. I agreed because saying no felt like admitting I needed help, and I was not ready for that truth. At first, it was small adjustments. Shared meals. Shared space. Shared schedules. My kitchen no longer smelled only like my cooking. My evenings no longer ended when I chose. I adjusted again, the way I always had. I noticed I began asking before using my own living room. I noticed my paperwork was sometimes moved. I noticed conversations stopping when I entered the room. None of it was dramatic. That is why I ignored it. I told myself this was what families did. I told myself this was love adapting to circumstance. I told myself discomfort was temporary. I told myself many things. Looking back now, I see it clearly. This was not the beginning of my loss. It was the beginning of their confidence. The first time Lila said it, she was smiling. We were standing in the hallway, the narrow one that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books. Sunlight came through the side window, landing on the framed photos I had not yet taken down. She held a mug that had once been mine. I noticed the chip on the rim and wondered when it had stopped being in my cabinet. One day all of this will be ours, she said lightly. You understand that, right? She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the walls. At the time, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because silence felt heavier than laughter. I told myself she was joking. I told myself young people spoke carelessly. I told myself there was no reason to correct her, because correcting someone assumes they are wrong, and I was not yet ready to believe that. I remember the exact sound my laugh made. Thin. Quick. It surprised even me. Ethan stood nearby, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up. He didn't smile. He didn't disagree. His silence was so ordinary that it barely registered, which is how the most important moments often pass us by. After that day, things shifted in small, almost polite ways. Lila began referring to decisions as we decisions. We should repaint. We think the upstairs bathroom needs work. We are considering renting out the guest room. She said it casually, conversationally, as if the ownership had already been agreed upon and she was merely updating me. I noticed she stopped asking questions and started making statements. The mail was sorted differently. Important envelopes were placed aside to look at later. Later often meant after dinner, when I was tired, or during phone calls I hadn't made. Papers I did not recognize appeared in neat stacks on the dining table. When I asked what they were, she would answer vaguely. Just things we're organizing. Old stuff that needs updating. Nothing urgent. Urgency, I would learn, is a relative thing. I told myself I was imagining tension because grief makes everything sharper. I had lost my husband, after all. It made sense that I would feel displaced in my own home. That was the story I told myself, because it was kinder than the truth. The truth was quieter. Ethan stopped asking my opinion. He informed me instead. He used the same calm voice I had once used when explaining difficult things to clients. I recognized it immediately. That voice says, "This is already decided." One evening, I found a file open on the computer in the study. My study. The one room that had remained unchanged since my husband's death. On the screen was a list of assets. My assets. Properties, accounts, projected values. Cleanly organized. Professionally labeled. When I asked about it, Lila didn't flinch. We're just planning ahead, she said. You don't want to leave these things messy. Messy. That word lingered with me. I closed the laptop myself. My hands were steady. That surprised me most of all. I nodded and said nothing. Silence had always been my way of keeping the peace. I did not yet understand that silence can also be interpreted as permission. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. Pipes ticking. Floorboards shifting. The familiar sounds felt foreign, as if I were sleeping in someone else's home. I told myself families say careless things. I told myself love sometimes oversteps. I told myself tomorrow would feel different. But something had already been said that could not be taken back. And I had heard it clearly. It began with manners. That is how these things often start, not with cruelty, but with politeness that slowly rearranges the room until you no longer recognize where you stand. "Please call before you come over," Lila said one morning, smoothing the edge of a cushion that had never needed straightening before. I was already inside the house. My keys were still in my hand, warm from my coat pocket. She smiled as if this were normal, as if I were a guest who had forgotten herself. I apologized. The word left my mouth before I had time to question it. I had spent my life taking responsibility for other people's comfort. Old habits do not die loudly. They fade. Soon after, it became, "Don't interfere." She said it softly, with a gentle hand on my arm, when I asked why a contractor was measuring the upstairs bedroom. My bedroom. The room where I had slept for 32 years, where I had watched my husband grow thinner, quieter, smaller. She said they were improving things and that surprises were better when left alone. Then it changed again. "This isn't your business anymore." That sentence arrived over dinner. Plates half full. The smell of roasted chicken still warm in the air. Ethan said it without lifting his eyes. He cut his food carefully, as if keeping his movements precise would keep the moment contained. I set my fork down. I remember doing it slowly, deliberately. The sound against the plate felt too loud, as though the room itself were listening. After that, my belongings began to shift. Not all at once. Never all at once. A scarf I kept by the door disappeared. Photo albums were moved to the garage for safekeeping. Important papers were placed in new folders I had never seen before. When I asked where something was, Lila answered lightly, almost cheerfully. "We're organizing. You'll thank us later." Later never came. My chair in the living room was replaced. Not removed, just exchanged for something smaller, stiffer, unfamiliar. The mug I had used every morning for years was no longer in the cabinet I reached for. It appeared on a lower shelf, beside chipped cups I had planned to donate. These were small things. That was the danger. Each change could be explained. Each moment could be dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that felt like fog. You do not notice fog until you realize you can no longer see the road. I began asking permission in my own home. Before turning on the television. Before inviting a friend. Before opening drawers that once held my life. I stopped hosting altogether because the house no longer felt like it belonged to me. Ethan started correcting me. My memory. My timelines. My understanding of finances I had managed for decades. "That's not how it works anymore," he would say. Or, "You're remembering it wrong." I believed him more than I believed myself. At night, I lay awake listening to footsteps that were not mine. Doors opening. Soft voices behind closed walls. I felt foolish for feeling erased, so I told no one. Shame thrives in quiet places. I endured it because I believed endurance was love. Because I believed family required patience. Because I had survived worse. But survival is not the same as belonging. And without realizing it, I was being prepared. Not for care. For removal. And now we return to where everything finally broke, though at the time it felt unreal, as if I were watching my own life from the wrong side of glass. It was March 17th. The morning was cold but bright, the kind that promises normality. The clock above the stove read 7:42. I noticed because it was the same clock my husband had installed years ago, crooked no matter how many times I tried to straighten it. Ethan asked me to sit at the kitchen table. His tone was careful, almost respectful. Lila stood near the doorway, not seated, not involved, as if she were supervising rather than participating. There was a folder on the table. Thick. Heavy. Its edges were perfectly aligned. "We just need your signature," Ethan said. "It's procedural. You don't need to worry." I opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents I recognized instantly. Ownership transfers. Power authorizations. Language designed to look helpful while quietly erasing me. The house. The company. Accounts I had built over decades, all reorganized as if I were already gone. "I'm not signing this," I said. My voice did not shake. That surprised me. I had expected fear, or pleading, or something emotional. Instead, there was only certainty. Ethan stepped closer. Not fast. Not angry. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, the one I had given him last Christmas. He lowered his voice, as if we were sharing a secret. "You don't understand what you're refusing," he said. "You're making this difficult." "I understand exactly," I answered. For a moment, no one spoke. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, a pipe clicked. Then his hand came out of nowhere. The slap was sharp and quick. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just sudden and final. My head turned slightly with the force. There was a ringing in my ears, a taste of metal in my mouth. I touched my cheek without thinking, as if my body reacted before my heart could. Ethan froze. Not in regret. In calculation. Layla moved immediately. She walked past us to the front door and opened it wide. Cold air rushed into the house. Morning light filled the hallway, exposing everything. "Pack your things," she said. "This is no longer your home." Her voice was calm. Almost bored. As if she were announcing a schedule change. I looked down and saw the suitcase beside me. Already packed. Not by me. By them. Clothes chosen without my presence. Objects selected without permission. My life reduced to what they decided was acceptable. On the kitchen table, one document had been left behind. Positioned carefully, deliberately. Amount, $4,800,000. Signature, my son's. I understood then. Not emotionally. Logically. This was not an argument. It was a removal. I picked up the suitcase. My hands were steady. I did not cry. I did not speak. I walked past them and out the door. It closed behind me with a soft, ordinary sound. That is how a mother became an outcast. They thought the door closing behind me meant the story was over. They thought the suitcase in my hand meant surrender. What they did not understand was that I had spent a lifetime solving problems while keeping my face calm. Panic was never my language. Procedure was. I stood on the front step for a moment, the cold air pressing into my cheek where his hand had landed. I could still feel the outline of the slap, like a fingerprint made of heat. I did not turn around. I walked to my car, set the suitcase in the trunk, and sat behind the wheel until my breathing steadied. My phone showed 7:56 a.m. I did not call Ethan. I did not call a friend. I called my lawyer. His name was Daniel Reeves. He had handled my business contracts for years, the kind of man who read every line as if it were a map out of a burning building. He answered on the second ring. "Margaret," he said, already alert. "Is everything all right?" "No," I told him. "But I'm all right. I need you to open the estate file. And I need you to pull the corporate documents, every revision, every addendum." There was a short pause, the kind that told me he understood exactly how serious my calm voice was. "Where are you?" he asked. "In my car," I said. "Outside my house." "Not my house, apparently. I'll be at your office in an hour." When I arrived, Daniel didn't offer tea or sympathy. He offered a chair, a glass of water, and his attention. That was why I trusted him. We spread papers across his conference table. The same table where I had once signed contracts while my husband waited in the lobby, humming to himself because he could not remember why we were there. I watched Daniel's pen move as he marked sections, flipping pages with quiet precision. They had you sign some things last year, he said, not accusing, just stating. Yes, I admitted. They said it was to simplify. Daniel nodded. And you did simplify. For you. He turned one page, then another, and tapped a paragraph with the capped end of his pen. Here, he said. This clause is still active. It was a paragraph I remembered insisting on after my husband's diagnosis worsened. I had not called it paranoia. I had called it planning. It said that any transfer of ownership above a certain threshold required my direct confirmation through an independent attorney. It said that if I was removed from my residence by coercion, all authorizations granted to household members were automatically suspended pending review. It was not dramatic language. It was clean, technical, and merciless. Lila had laughed when I had asked for it. Ethan had rolled his eyes and said, "Mom, you watch too many crime shows." I hadn't. I had simply watched people. Daniel opened his laptop and logged into the corporate portal we used for filings. "We can lock this down today," he said. "But we need evidence of coercion." I reached into my purse and pulled out my small notebook. I had started carrying it months ago, when my mail began disappearing and conversations began changing the moment I entered the room. In it were dates, times, and brief notes. Nothing emotional. Just facts. Like, February 3rd, bank letter opened, resealed. February 19th, contract folder moved from study. March 1st, Lila asked for online banking to help. Daniel's eyes lifted. "You kept records." "I keep records," I said. "That's how I built everything." Then I did the one thing they had not expected. I opened my banking app. I had set it up with alerts years earlier. Every withdrawal over $500. Every new payee. Every transfer between accounts. I had never turned the alerts off because I didn't like surprises. In the last month, there had been too many. I handed the phone to Daniel. He scrolled, expression tightening. "These payees," he said, "were they authorized?" "No," I replied. "And I never gave Ethan my password." Daniel slid the phone back to me gently, as if it were something sharp. "All right," he said. "We start with a freeze. Then we revoke access. Then we notify the bank and the accountant." Quietly. Quietly. That word felt like air returning to my lungs. As I sat there, I realized something else. The document on the kitchen table, the one marked $4,800,000, wasn't proof of their success. It was proof of their hurry. They had moved too fast. They had underestimated the boring, unglamorous power of paperwork. They had mistaken my silence for weakness and my kindness for consent. Daniel placed his hand flat on the file and looked at me. "Margaret," he said, "you're not trapped." I nodded once. "I know," I said. "And now they're going to learn it too." Before I left his office, Daniel asked, "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" I thought of hotels and borrowed rooms, and then of the small townhouse I had bought years earlier as an investment and never rented, a place I kept because I disliked being cornered. "Yes," I said. "I have a place." While his assistant made copies, Daniel called my bank manager. He didn't argue. He stated, a temporary hold, a review of recent transfers, and a note on my accounts, no instructions from anyone but me or counsel. Then he pointed to my message thread with Ethan. Buried among check and texts was Lila's line from 2 weeks earlier, "If you don't sign, we'll make other arrangements." At the time I had gone quiet. Now it read like a warning delivered in writing. Coercion does not always shout. Sometimes it types. I told Daniel about the doorbell camera Ethan had installed for safety. He nodded once. "Request the footage," he said. "The timestamp will matter." When I walked out, the air smelled like rain on pavement. My cheek still ached, but my hands were steady. They had counted on my embarrassment to keep me silent. They were about to learn the difference. I drove to that townhouse with my chipped travel mug in the cup holder, and for the first time in months, the silence felt like mine. The unraveling did not arrive with shouting or drama. It came quietly, the way real consequences usually do, disguised as routine interruptions. The first call came 2 days later. Ethan rang while I was standing in the empty townhouse kitchen, rinsing my chipped travel mug at the sink. The space echoed when I set it down. I let the phone ring until the sound stopped on its own. I did not need to hear his voice to know what had happened. An hour after that, the bank called me. They spoke carefully, formally, as institutions do when they realize they have been standing on thin ice. Several transfers had been flagged. Access credentials had been revoked. A temporary freeze was now permanent until review. They apologized for the inconvenience. I thanked them for the efficiency. By that afternoon, the accountant reached out. Then the corporate office. Then the property manager for the house I had been told was no longer mine. Everything slowed for them at once. Payments stopped mid-process. Cards declined without explanation. Automatic withdrawals failed and left polite error messages where certainty had once lived. The house, suddenly, required documentation they could not provide. Keys without authority are just metal. 3 days later, Lila called. Her voice was different. Still calm, but thinner around the edges, like paper held too close to a flame. She did not accuse me. She did not apologize. She asked questions instead, as if information might rearrange reality back into her favor. There seems to be a mistake, she said. We can't access anything. I said nothing. She continued, more quickly now. Ethan's card was declined at the airport. We're supposed to leave tomorrow. Something has been locked. I looked at the calendar on the wall. March 22nd. 5 days since I had walked out of that house with a suitcase they packed for me. There's no mistake, I said. The silence on the other end of the line was sharp. I could hear her breathing, shallow and controlled. You can't do this, she said finally. You wouldn't. I already have, I replied. That was the moment the balance shifted. Not because I raised my voice, but because I did not. Over the next week, the consequences stacked up like unopened mail. The contractor stopped work. The bank requested interviews. The accountant asked for explanations that could not be improvised. The house reverted to my name, cleanly and completely, because ownership prefers clarity. Then Ethan called again. This time, he cried. He spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other, explanations and apologies woven together so tightly they became indistinguishable. He said he hadn't meant it to go that far. He said Lila had pushed. He said stress made people act strangely. He said family should forgive. I listened. I listened the same way I once listened to clients who had waited too long to tell the truth. Calmly. Without interruption. Without taking responsibility for their panic. Mom, he said at last. We need you to fix this. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not in pain. In clarity. I already did, I said. There was a pause. A long one. Then his voice changed, sharpened by fear. You're destroying us. No, I replied. I'm letting consequences arrive. They tried again. Emails. Messages. Voicemails sent late at night and early in the morning. Each one softer than the last. Each one asking for access, for understanding, for a return to the arrangement that had served them so well. I did not block them. I did not respond. Silence, used carefully, is not cruelty. It is a boundary. A month later, they asked to meet. I agreed. We sat across from each other in a neutral place, a small cafe where no one knew our history. Ethan looked older. Lila looked tired. They spoke of forgiveness, of misunderstanding, of starting over. They never spoke of the slap. They never spoke of the suitcase. They never spoke of the door. They assumed I would fill in the gaps for them, the way I always had. I finished my coffee slowly, set the cup down, and met their eyes. And then I made my choice. I listened to them without interrupting, my hands wrapped around the warm cup in front of me, the faint smell of coffee grounding me in the moment. Ethan spoke first, his words practiced, careful. Lila followed, adding softness where she thought it belonged. They talked about pressure, about fear, about mistakes made in haste. They spoke as if context might dissolve consequence. I noticed how they avoided certain words. No one said slap. No one said door. No one said leave. They spoke instead of family. Of history. Of how much I meant to them. It was a familiar performance, one I had seen before in boardrooms and offices, when people realized leverage had shifted. When they finally stopped talking, the silence felt earned. I hear you, I said. Ethan leaned forward, relief flickering across his face. Lila's shoulders loosened slightly, as if she believed we were moving toward agreement. But I'm not coming back, I continued. The words landed gently. That was intentional. I did not want drama to distract from truth. You don't have to punish us, Lila said quickly. We can work something out. We can start fresh. I shook my head. Slowly. Deliberately. This isn't punishment, I said. It's a decision. Ethan frowned. You're my mother. Yes, I replied. And I am also a woman who was told to leave her own home. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see him searching for the version of me that would soften, that would step in and repair what had broken. That woman had existed once. She was tired now. I forgave you before you asked, I said. I forgave you the moment I chose not to ruin you publicly. But forgiveness doesn't require me to return to a place where I was diminished. Lila's voice trembled. So that's it? That's it, I said. I stood, placed a few bills on the table, and picked up my coat. My hands were steady. That mattered to me. As I walked out, I felt something loosen in my chest, a tightness I had mistaken for duty for far too long. Outside, the air was cool and clean. I breathed deeply, not because I was relieved, but because I was free to breathe without permission. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt quietly. I sold the old house. Not in anger. Not in haste. I walked through it one last time before listing it, touching the doorframes, the banister, the kitchen counter where so many contracts had been signed and meals prepared. I took nothing sentimental with me except a single photograph and the chipped mug I still used every morning. I moved into a smaller home with light-filled rooms and no history pressing against the walls. I arranged the furniture myself. I chose where things belonged and left space where silence could rest. I volunteered 2 mornings a week at a local literacy center. I traveled without explaining myself to anyone. I learned the pleasure of making plans that required no approval. Sometimes, Ethan sends a message. Short. Careful. I reply when I want to. Sometimes I don't. That is not cruelty. That is balance. I have learned that love without boundaries is not love. It is exposure. Now, when I drink my coffee in the morning, I do it slowly. I listen to the quiet. I no longer confuse silence with loneliness. Silence is not empty. It is freedom. If you've ever felt like a stranger in a home you helped build, you're not alone. And your story isn't over yet. I live in a different house now. Smaller. Quieter. The windows face east, and the light comes in gently, without asking anything of me. In the mornings, I sit at the table with my chipped mug and let the coffee cool the way I like it. No one rushes me. No one corrects me. The silence stays where I put it. I used to think silence meant something was wrong. That it was a sign of being forgotten or left behind. I filled it with noise, with obligation, with other people's needs. Now I understand that silence is only empty if you abandon yourself inside it. Some days, memories arrive without warning. A laugh from the past. A holiday that no longer exists. I let them pass through me without argument. I do not rewrite them. I do not soften them. They are part of what made me careful, and care is not weakness. I have learned to trust my instincts again. To read the fine print. To listen when discomfort speaks quietly instead of waiting for it to shout. I no longer confuse love with endurance or loyalty with disappearance. I did not lose a family. I lost an illusion. What I gained was myself. If you are listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life, I want you to know something. You are not ungrateful for wanting respect. You are not difficult for setting boundaries. And you are not wrong for choosing peace over familiarity. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is leave the table when she is no longer welcome and build her own place to sit. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength. Your story is still unfolding. And so is mine.